bucka. Haha. You know the deal.
So in our introduction to percents, we talked about how to write a percent as a fraction and how to write a percent as a decimal. What we're going to talk about next is going the other way around. So if we are given a fraction, how to change that to a percent. Or if we're given a decimal, how to change that to a percent. So let's start with a fraction. Suppose we have the fraction 83 out of 100. So let's say on a test, the test was out of 100 and you got 83 out of 100. Well, as we talked about in the previous video, the word percent literally means out of 100. So if you had to write this fraction as a percent, another way to say this fraction is 83 out of 100. So that's the same as 83%. So if we have a fraction that's out of 100, it's pretty straightforward. Our numerator is the percent, because the word percent literally means out of 100. So if our denominator is 100, it's our numerator out of 100. So it's our numerator as a percent. Well, oftentimes we're dealing with fractions that aren't out of 100. So, for example, suppose you had a test that was out of 25. And let's say you got 17 out of 25 on that test. And you wanted to know, well, what is that as a percent? If we want to know what that is as a percent, again, a percent means out of 100. So what we want this fraction to be is, we want it to be out of 100. So we want the denominator to be 100. Well, the nice thing here is we're able to write equivalent fractions, because we can change 25 to 100. To change 25 to 100, we multiply it by 4. So that's what we have to do to 17 as well. We have to multiply it by 4. And when we do that, 17 times 4 is 68. So 17 out of 25 is the same as 68 out of 100. And now that we have a fraction out of 100, well, again, the word percent just means out of 100. So 68 out of 100, we can also say as 68%. So what that means is, if you got 17 out of 25 on a test, you got 68%. Here's another example where we may want to change a fraction to a percent. So I'm going to use the example again of a quiz or a test. Suppose you got 13 out of 15 on a quiz or a test, and you want to know what that is as a percent. Well, the challenge that we run into here, when I try to make this a fraction out of 100, unfortunately 15 doesn't go evenly into 100. So we don't have the option here to change this fraction to a fraction out of 100. I can't write an equivalent fraction out of 100, because 15 can't be multiplied by a whole number to be made into 100. But if you remember, in fractions we talked about how to change a fraction to a number, or most times a fraction to a decimal. To change this fraction to a decimal, we simply do the math. A fraction is a division question. The top divided by the bottom. So the division question here is 13 divided by 15. And when we answer that question, we probably need a calculator to answer that question. And when we use our calculator to divide 13 divided by 15, what we find is we get 0.866666, and that 6 repeats forever. So most of the time with percents, we're going to be rounding, and usually we're going to round to the nearest hundredth, the second decimal place. So we're going to look the first place to the right. There we have a 6, so we're going to round up. So if we round that, that rounds to 0.87. So 13 out of 15 is about 0.87 when we round it to the nearest hundredth. So here we have our fraction written as a decimal. Now, what we want though is we want to write that as a percent. So if you recall when we were talking about how to change decimals or numbers to fractions in our fractions unit, anytime we have a number and we want to write it as a fraction, we always put the number over 1. And now, because we want it to be a percent, we want the denominator to be 100. Well, 15 didn't go evenly into 100, but 1 does go evenly into 100. And to change 1 to 100, we multiply it by 100. So that's what we have to do to 0.87. Whatever we do to the bottom, we have to do to the top. And when we multiply by 100, we move the decimal 2 places to the right. So we get 87 out of 100. And again, that was rounded. It was actually 86.66666, but we'll round it to the nearest percent. And now that we have that out of 100, well, the word percent literally means out of 100. So another way to write 87 out of 100 is 87%. Now, if we look at the previous example, 17 over 25, we were able to make that into a fraction out of 100. But suppose I wanted to make that into a decimal. Well, we would have to divide 17 divided by 25. And if you've got a calculator handy, what you'll find is that is 0.68. Again, if we want to change that to a percent, we want it to be out of 100. Right now, it's over 1. Anytime we have a number and we want to write it as a fraction, we just put 1 in the denominator. We want to change that 1 to 100, so we have to times it by 100. So that's what we have to do to the numerator as well. And what we get is 68 out of 100, which is the same as 68%. So even though this fraction, we were able to convert it so that we had 100 in the denominator, that was an option here. It wasn't an option here because 15 doesn't go evenly into 100. But we always have the option of changing the fraction to a decimal. We can always do that. We can't necessarily always make the denominator into 100. The denominator doesn't necessarily always evenly go into 100 like it didn't here. But we do always have the option to change a fraction to a decimal. And going back to the first example, 83 divided by 100 is 0.83. And as we talked about in the last example, well, we know 83% is the same as 0.83 because percent means out of 100, which means divided by 100. So 83% is the same as 0.83. So to finish off our lesson on writing fractions as percents, I'm going to ask you to answer a few questions here. So for each one of these fractions here, or each one of these values, I'm going to ask you to do two things. First, write it as a number, usually as a decimal, and second, as a percent. You'll notice for the first 5 are all fractions. They all start off as fractions. The last one is actually already written as a number. So you actually don't, the answer to A is already there in question number 6. It is written as a number. So you just have to write that as a percent. And just remember that a percent is always out of 100. So in the denominator, it has to be 100. So with question number 6, you have to think about, well, what is in the denominator right now? But again, with all of the other ones, first change it to a number. Most of the time it involves a decimal. And then change that decimal to a percent. If you're able to do that, congratulations. You now have a firm understanding of changing fractions to percents.